The massive blaze around Fort McMurray last week caused the largest evacuation in Alberta's history. And while our province hasn't seen such an inferno for generations, every year communities across Northern Ontario face evacuation orders and the threat of wildfires. Joining us now to consider how to manage the risks this province faces, Tim Lynham, Forest Fire Research Project Leader with Natural Resources Canada. It's good to see you here, Tim.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
All the way from Sault Ste. Marie?
Yes.
So we're happy to have you here. I think the one thing everybody wants to know here in Ontario is what's happening in Fort Mac possible here?
It is definitely. The short answer is yes. We have over 100 communities in and around the boreal forest. They're all vulnerable to this kind of fire.
How come?
It's because the forest is on the edge of their doorstep. And often what happens in these situations is that the worst part of the fire comes from the forest. It could start in the community and move into the forest, but it's when it comes back from the forest into the community that it drops embers, and often it's dropping them on rooftops that start to burn.
Let's show, Sheldon, if we can, this map of the boreal forests in Ontario. There we go. Now the green shows the boreal forests, which are the most prone, I gather, to forest fires. And then the blue area are the Hudson Bay lowlands, which they can also have forest fires there too, can they not?
Yes, yeah.
They can do that too.
Yep.
So what factors would go into the creation of the kind of fire that we saw out west?
Well, you need to have that kind of intense fire. You need to have, and people have been referring to it, the perfect storm. Low humidity, high temperatures, high winds are a real killer. And in this case, they also had very low snowfall from the previous winter. We usually count on snowfall, which gives us water during the melting period, and rainfall in the spring, and they haven't had either. So you've got a whole bunch of factors that have lined up against Fort McMurray. That has happened in Ontario too. This one's quite extreme in Fort McMurray, and it's the largest.
Let's bring, Sheldon, if we can, bring the map up again, because I'd like Tim to just sort of take us through which areas of the province you think are potentially most prone to the kinds of things we're seeing out west. Go ahead.
The area that's most prone is the green area, which is the boreal forest. Boreal meaning north. That's really what it means. So then beyond that is you get away from the treed part and you get into peatlands. Now the interesting part that's happening as we go on in time is that the peatlands have been frozen for 10,000 years since the last glaciation, but they're starting to thaw because of warming. And so we're getting lightning strikes in peatland that's burning that didn't used to burn. So on top of the fires that we've had for decades in the boreal forest, which where most of our communities are, we're also getting fires in the peatlands up towards the Hudson Bay lowlands.
How do they start? Most
of these are starting by lightning. So they start with lightning. Lightning's about 50% of the fires in Ontario, but it's the cause of about 85% of the burned area. That's because most of the fires are remote, and therefore by the time we can get resources to the fires, they've grown larger in size, and a larger fire has a higher probability of getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
How big does a fire have to be before you will actually even recognize that it's happening?
Well, it's just a few hectares, so maybe 100 meters by 100 meters. It depends on the type of detection that's available from the agency in that area. So we have very intense detection over the boreal forest, and less qualified farther north. In fact, they use other sources like maybe remote sensing. They even rely on commercial aircraft to report fires in the far north.
Huh. So I guess there's an assumption that somebody sees it and calls you, and that's how you find out. That's not how it works.
Well, that happens when it's close to communities, because if it's closer to a community, there's a higher probability of it staying small because it gets reported early and resources get there. If it's far away, the probabilities work the other way around.
I have heard that in northeastern Ontario, say around the Timmins area, there are fires that burn all year round. Is that right?
There are fires that burn all year round, but usually they are in peat, and there is peat in the Timmins area. There's a fire, I believe, in British Columbia that's been burning for almost 3 decades. And what happens is it gets down deep into the peat, it smolders through the wintertime, and it comes back up again in the spring. We have some of those in Ontario too.
Are they dangerous?
Well, they're dangerous when they pop back up. Most of the time they pop back up when the conditions aren't really conducive to a large fire, so then they can try and put them out on the surface. But it doesn't mean you're getting down deep and getting them out completely. They have the same problem with fires in coal mines in China. They can burn underground for a long time.
There are fires burning in Ontario right now, I presume.
There are. There was quite a large one west of Red Lake and Ear Falls.
This is in northwestern Ontario.
Northwestern Ontario. It was just east of the Manitoba border, and the last I saw it was over 40,000 hectares, which is considerable, but there's no community right in its path. It's in a provincial park. It's in a forest that needs fire for regeneration, and they're dealing with it.
Explain that. You need fires to happen from time to time.
Well, it's not that we need them, but the ecology of the forest. All of our boreal forest depends on fire for renewal. It's one form of renewal. There's others, but it's the one that happens the fastest. It releases seed for the next generation of trees. It gets rid of diseases that are in the forest. It gets rid of trees that are actually old and can make the forest more fire prone if you leave them for a long time. So there's a balance between ecological needs, but also economic. It costs a lot if you put everything out.
Okay, you're going to forgive me here. I'm a bit old school on this. I don't know what a hectare is. How many acres is that fire in northwestern Ontario?
That would be about 100,000 acres.
Okay, that's huge.
It is. It's
But
large.
you say not dangerous or not problematic?
Well, not at this time. I mean, the Ontario government is working on the fire. It's not threatening a community. They're doing whatever they can at this time. They're going to try and keep it where it is, but they also have an early spring situation. They've sent some resources to the out west, and they have new resources coming in. So they're doing their ultimate just to keep it where it is.
And what, in fact, are they doing?
Because I'm not on the management line, I don't know. I suspect that they're monitoring it hour by hour. They probably have some water bombers working parts of it to try and keep it contained.
What kind of fleet of water bombers do we have in the province of Ontario?
Ontario, I believe, has about 9 or 10 large, the big yellow birds, everybody calls them. They drop about 1,600 gallons of water. There are 50 of those across Canada, and Ontario has 8 or 9 or 10 of them.
Do we need more?
Well, that's not something that I'm an expert in. There was a study done 30 years ago that involved good work at the University of Toronto, the fire group there, and they recommended that the right mix for Ontario was about 8 or 9 or 10. And Ontario, whether they used that information to make their decision, I don't know, but that's what happened. They wound up with 8 or 9 or 10 of them.
Generally speaking, do you think we adequately manage and control the forest fires that are burning in this province?
I actually think that we've done a remarkable job. If I were to look at the historical data for Ontario from 1918, we know that on average there was anywhere between 200 and 600 large fires, and that's bigger than 100 acres or 40 hectares. And now it fluctuates between about 50 and 150. The people in Ontario who fight fires were asked to do a tough job, get the number of large fires down, and they've done it in spades. But we're down to the minimum. It's hard to go any lower without a lot more money. We're at we call it the law of diminishing returns. So what they're now doing is they're looking at a new strategy, which they implemented last year, which gives them the leeway to let some fires be managed less tightly, maybe in the far north in particular. But there's never, ever an option to allow them to come into your community.
No, I get that, but I presume a fire that is 100,000 acres, you can't really fight that on the ground, can you? That's got to be done by the air?
No. I mean, there was a good film clip from the water bomber pilots from out west. Water bombers don't put out fires. And in fact, you can't often use a water bomber on the head of a fire because it's too intense. So where they often work is on the sides. The fire crews can work on, they can try to work on the sides, and when they get an opportunity, when the fire settles down a little bit, they'll also work on the head of the fire. But the bombers don't put out the fires, the people on the ground do. Or the rain. Often, like the Fort McMurray fire is probably going to be put out by weather eventually when they get significant rain.
But they've been concerned about the fact that it's been too hot and not wet enough, right? So
I don't see any significant rainfall in the Fort McMurray area for at least 15 days, based on the forecasts.
That's not good.
So it'll keep burning. It could burn for weeks and months.
Okay, let me read you something here. This is from Toddy Steelman, who's Executive Director of the School of Environment and Sustainability, University of Saskatchewan, who said the following: "The question becomes, if we've got areas where fire can burn, the most responsible thing to do ecologically, fiscally, and for long-term health is to let those fires burn. If we don't let them burn, we have to pay that account down the line. The forest will burn eventually." Is that right?
It's right, except that what they're not using the word "let it burn," because you can't use that term, but what you can do is you have to give it an appropriate response. The response might be, we're aware of it, we see its significance and its potential, and we have to evaluate what the threats are before we spend a lot of Ontario taxpayers' money to put it out, because ecologically it has a benefit. So she's right on track. It's just that I've tried to stop using the word "let it burn" because it sounds like you're doing nothing. But they are doing something. They're keeping, at least monitoring and keeping on top of it and making decisions day by day. And that could change tomorrow because something becomes a new issue. A bigger wind, and all of a sudden smoke could be blowing into a community, and you need to deal with that.
But I can tell, it's counterintuitive to say, yes, let it burn, that's our strategy. You appreciate the fact that that sounds kind of weird, right?
Yeah, and that is not the strategy. That is not the strategy with any agency. Every agency is working towards a strategy where they take an appropriate response, which might be full suppression to limited suppression. And they have people who are experienced and they have tools to help them make that decision.
So let's look at the other side of the coin, which is you've told us about some of the positive impacts that a fire burning can have. Should we be letting these things happen then?
Well, I believe we need to have some happen, yes, because we're being pushed anyway. And I think that if we're spending over $1 billion already in Canada for the level of suppression we have, but it's harder to keep it at that level. These fires, you can't stop the fires from burning. Steve Pine, who's an American historian, writer, and also has a strong interest in fire, he said, if you live in a place like the boreal forest, you have two choices. You cut it all down, or you learn to live with it. We're not going to take the first option. We're trying to deal with the second one, but there's a huge pressure ridge now, which is a changing climate, which is warmer, and it's going to mean more fire.
Do you worry that we're over-managing this thing?
No, I don't think we're over-managing it right now. I think that the people who are managing right now have got some really phenomenal tools and expertise, and they're doing a really, really good job. And I think that this new strategy, particularly in Ontario, is a step forward.
How do you decide which fires are okay to let go and which fires you've really got to take an emergency, we got to go get this out?
It has to do with a level of remoteness usually and its potential for growth. So we have, Canada has one of the best prediction models for fire behavior in the world. We use it, the agencies use it, it's used all across Canada. So everybody's using the same language and the same system in Canada. And it's used other parts of the world. And so they evaluate the potential. If it's anywhere near a community, they're going to put it out. So the only ones that have the potential for, say, some limited monitoring are going to be ones that are a long way from people in particular and important resources.
When you say when it's near a community, how big does that community have to be to get your attention?
It's usually probably anywhere from 100 to from that.
Small, eh?
Well, the fire in northwestern Ontario right now was threatening, I believe, 100 cottagers. Not cottages, but there was 100 people. I think they were evacuated because there was potential spread. So, I mean, it wouldn't matter if it was one, but most of the communities are at least a handful of 100, 200, 300, 800, a couple of thousand.
Forgive me for not knowing this, but have there been fatalities because of Ontario forest fires?
Well, fatalities to civilians?
Yeah.
Not since about 1938. The last one, I made a mistake on this earlier in a broadcast, but I was told that the last one in Canada was in 1989. It was a woodsman who got trapped. But the last one in Ontario would go back to about 1938. There was a time in northern Ontario, this is some famous fires, Matheson and Halyborough, where the logging operations on the edge of town, where they were doing a lot of sawmilling in those days, they left piles of sawdust. And those big fires actually happened in October with dry wind conditions. But we don't even do that anymore. So we had created a false fuel in that case on the edge of the community. It caught fire and it came back into the community. Now that doesn't happen. And the fatalities are mostly either on the fire line where somebody it could be a heart attack, you're injured by a tree coming down, and most of the fatalities happen in the air with the firefighting resources.
So that's what I wondered. So firefighters have perished doing their job.
They have, but they haven't, I can't think of a situation in Ontario where they burned up in like an operational fire.
What happens when you evacuate a community? I mean, chances are, does everything in that community burn down?
Well, no, not everything burns down.
No?
So it's usually that's coming from the forest. So it's wherever the sparks land, if it finds a combustible material, and it's usually rooftops. What happens is sparks land on a rooftop. If it's shingles or combustible, it's burning through the roof. It burns a hole through the roof, and then all hell breaks loose. The house implodes, the windows blow out, and the fire roars through. If you can protect the rooftops, you're in a good situation. In Australia, they took a policy where they tried to keep one able-bodied person home at homes, and they applied water to the rooftops, and they were successful saving many, many houses, even when the fire went through. But it also caught them and backfired in another situation, so it's not a perfect solution.
That's what I wondered, because you often see pictures on the news of people hosing down their roofs. Does that actually work?
Well, it has worked in Australia. You have to make sure that you have an absolute guaranteed water supply, because if you lose your water, then you need to go.
How many times a year will somebody give the order to evacuate a community because of a fire?
I would say that in Ontario, it could easily happen anywhere from a couple of times to 10 or 15. And it can be quite a burden if there's a lot of people, because usually in Ontario, there are not always roads to the communities. So they usually evacuate by air. They all have airports. And there are times when they call in the military because they can supply a lot of aircraft very quickly. They like to get in, get the job done, and get out. And that's exactly what you want with an evacuation.
Now, I appreciate that the fires that are burning right now in northwestern Ontario are, as you tell us, in some fairly remote areas. But one does have to ask whether or not Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, Sudbury, Timmins, I mean, we do have some larger centers in northern Ontario. Can you imagine in the ensuing decade any of them being under threat?
Yes, I can. I mean, we had a 300,000 hectare fire 100 kilometers east of Sault Ste. Marie in 1948. It's the biggest in Ontario history. We shouldn't lull ourselves into thinking it can't happen. We have combustible forest fuels around Sault Ste. Marie. They have them around Thunder Bay. We just haven't had the right conditions for it to happen.
So is there something that the people there ought to be thinking about or doing to prevent the awful from happening?
There is a large national program called Fire Smart, and that's about fireproofing communities. We're doing research right across the country in what they call the wildland-urban interface. That's where you live meets the forest, which is, Fort McMurray is an example of that. And the idea is you try to create gaps in the forest around your community. You try to convert from coniferous to broadleaf vegetation. But even in the case of Fort McMurray, they had green aspen and poplar trees, but they hadn't greened up this year. So they were still at a disadvantage for it happening in the spring before they had this potential natural fire break, which is the green vegetation.
Now, Tim, I notice from your title you are a forest fire research project leader. What kind of research are you doing right now?
Right now, I'm working mostly on the use of thermal infrared remote sensing, mostly satellites, for monitoring and detecting fires. This is breaking edge material, research, but we're not the leaders in it. Actually, we have colleagues in the United Kingdom, and we're working very closely with space agencies, which includes the German Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency. We work with colleagues. There's a whole group of us internationally that work through a group that's coordinated in the United States.
And how will all of that help?
It helps because we're looking at what kinds of assets that we need, either remote sensing platforms on aircraft or space assets, satellites for detecting. There are detectors now available that are as big as the last joint on my finger that can see a forest fire that's 3 meters by 3 meters on the ground. They can see it from 700 kilometers in space. They are incredibly sensitive. We have the technology, and it does not put out fires. It just means that maybe you can find more of them sooner when they're small if you want it, but it costs millions of dollars to build these satellites. It's a cost benefit, and we're working on that. But there's also the science about how the remote sensing, the thermal infrared works. Thermal infrared detectors are 10,000 times more sensitive to energy than your eye is to optical image light.
So theoretically, you get these things when they're smaller and easier to put out.
Yes.
That's the thinking.
But they also can tell you, collect information from a remote platform about the rate of spread of fires. Fires spread at different rates in different types of forest. So we need that information. We have some from the past decades, but now we can collect a lot of that information very quickly.
Tim, in our last minute, let's finish up on this. I know many politicians have been loath to sort of say, yes, Fort Mac happened because of climate change, or climate change has worsened what's happening at Fort Mac. Are you prepared to say that?
Well, I think it's irresponsible, I think, to say that climate change is responsible for a single event. I don't have that information. What we do know, the statistics, our data shows that the number of large fires in general across the country is going up. The number of fires is going up. We used to be 1.5 million hectares average. We're now at 2.3. We're headed, based on the predictions, to doubling again this century. The world has a fever, and we can't ignore it anymore.
So you think it, I get you. You can't say that happened because of climate change, but if you look at the broader picture, you think that conclusion is inescapable.
Yes. If you're going to be warmer and drier, you're going to have more fire.
Gotcha. Tim Lynham, it's awfully good of you to come in from the Soo tonight and help us out with this. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Tim Lynham with Natural Resources Canada.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.